Hi everyone, today we're going to show you how to install our rock sliders on the 2014 and newer Tundra pickup. Right here we're starting with just showing you the hardware and all the parts that come with the rock sliders. There's a PDF image included at the beginning of this video that will show what the hardware is, and then we'll also have a link on our website under the instructions tab with a PDF that shows a breakdown of all the hardware and what it's labeled as. The first thing we're going to start with is bolting the rock sliders together. So these rock sliders come in two pieces. Right here we have the driver's side rock slider, each half. We're going to start by lining up the two halves of the rock sliders together, and then we're going to be using the 3/8 grade 8 hardware to bolt the rock sliders together. So we've started with the driver's side rock slider here. We took the two halves of the sliders and lined them up to each other. We grabbed the 3/8 grade 8 hardware and inserted it through the three holes here that connect the sliders together. So we have 3/8 by 1 grade 8 bolt with a flat washer on each side, and then a locking washer, and then the nut for the 3/8 bolt. Once those are all inserted in that order, you can line up the sliders so the tubes are all flush and lined up well with each other, and then tighten down that hardware. So we've gotten the rock sliders all bolted together here. We lined up the flanges where they bolt together really nicely here so they're nice and flush and lined up all the way across. Tighten down our 3/8 bolts. Those can be tightened to about 35 foot-pounds there. So we did the same thing for both sides. So now both the driver and passenger side rock sliders are bolted together, tightened down, and they're ready to install on the truck. One thing to note also, these rock sliders are not powder coated. The reason is just because we're using these just for an install video, and that's all. They're not actually staying on the truck. You will want to get your rock sliders powder coated before you install them. Otherwise, they will rust very quickly. We're going to start with the driver's side of the vehicle first. We have our rock slider placed over here next to the vehicle. And the first thing we need to do is show you which brackets to remove first before the sliders can be installed. So looking on the bottom of the vehicle here along the frame rail, we're about midway right between both doors on the truck right now. We have to remove this bolt for this bracket here. And there's two more of those a little farther down the frame here and here. You use a 12mm wrench or socket for those. I have to remove this bolt and loosen the bracket also. This one is a 14mm. And then this one back here for the e-brake cable, we need to remove this bolt also, which is going to be use a 12mm socket or wrench for that one. All right, so we've gotten all of those bolts removed from the e-brake cable here. We got these brackets pulled away from the frame here and here, and then these brackets up towards the top of the frame. They also need to be loose with the bolts fully removed. Same with these little ones here. This one right here, and then farther up the frame, this guy here. They all have to be loose, and they have to be kind of held away from the frame, because when we put the rock slider up into place, the rock slider mounting plate is going to go between the frame and these brackets. So they need to be held away from the frame with some space there. So just kind of keep that in mind as you prep to lift the rock slider up into place, that the slider needs to go between these two pieces, between the frame and these brackets. So we're getting ready to line up the driver's side rock slider here. Wanted to show you first that there are two threaded holes in the bottom of the frame near the fuel tank here. So sometimes, these may or may not need to be cleaned out first before you install the rock slider. So those are an 8 by 1.25mm thread pitch. You might have to run a thread tap in there. There's another one here. So you might have to clean out those threads first. So you want to check those before you get the rock slider up into place. So those two holes are going to line up with these two on the rock slider here. And that's where we send these 8mm supplied bolts, so we'll thread up into the bottom of the frame. So when you're getting ready to put your rock slider in place and hold it up to the vehicle, you can line up these two holes with those threaded ones in the bottom of the frame. And then the other easiest way to reference where the slider lines up is this front flange here that bends under is going to go in line with this cross member right here for the transfer case, the one that goes across. So that flange will line up with this cross member here, and that's how you can line up the slider to the vehicle. So we now have the driver's side rock slider hanging in place on the vehicle. We just used two guys to lift it up into place, kind of laying underneath the slider. And like we said earlier in the video, we lined up the slider first with this cross member across here, so you get the alignment of the slider front to back on the vehicle approximately in the right spot there. And then we put in the two 8mm bolts in the bottom back here, just loosely threaded those into the frame to hold the rock slider in place. And then we also added one of the 1/2-inch flange bolts right here towards the front of the rock slider, just to hold the front of the slider in place. Right now those are just loose. So on the back side we have one of these square washers against the frame and then the nut. So that's just loosely installed right now to hold the slider in place on the vehicle. Okay, so after we loosely installed those 3 bolts just to hold the rock slider in place, we took a floor jack and pushed it under the slider and lifted up on this portion of the frame mounting plate here just to push the rock slider up tight against the frame of the vehicle. And then we tightened down the hardware just a little bit, not fully tight, but just enough. Snug these up just enough to hold the slider up tight to the bottom of the frame, so there's not a big space here. And then we tightened up one of the 1/2-inch flange bolts just a little bit to hold it tight to the frame. Still don't tighten them all the way because we want to have a little bit of movement to get all the rest of the hardware lined up and in place before you tighten anything down fully. So these here towards the front of the frame here, there's 3 of the 1/2-inch flange bolts that get put in through the rock slider through the frame, 2 there and 1 here behind this leg. So you put the 1/2-inch flange bolt in with a 1/2-inch flat washer from the outside, and then on the back side of the frame we will have one of the square nut plates that goes on the inside here. So these big metal plates that come with the rock sliders go on the inside of the frame to cover that large slotted hole that's in the frame. So put the square nut plate and then the flange nut onto the bolt on the inside of the frame. You can see we have those in place for both of those bolts here, and then the other one more towards the front of the frame there, up inside this box portion of the frame. So you want to install all 3 of those nut plates with flange nuts on the back. For this next portion of hardware along the frame rail, we have these 2 nut sticks that we send with the hardware kit. So there's a shorter one which goes more towards the front of the fuel tank and a longer one towards the back of the fuel tank. And there's a 1/2-inch flange nut or flange bolt with flat washer that threads into each one of these nut sticks. So the first one, we're going to take the shorter one, and we're starting at the front of the fuel tank here, and we're going to put this nut stick up through this opening next to the fuel tank, and it's going to go up inside the frame here, and we're going to hold it up in place right in that area. And then you're going to have the 1/2-inch flange bolt thread in from the outside of the frame here. We'll show you where that bolt goes in. So it's going to go through this hole right here, this large one. You'll put your 1/2-inch flange bolt through that hole after you line up the short nut stick in place with that one. So right now we're looking at right here is the front of the rock slider, the first mounting plate. This is the second mounting plate back towards the middle of the rock slider. You want to put that bolt in and line it up with this hole here once you install the nut stick from the back of the frame. All right, so now we're going to install the second nut stick towards the back. This is the longer one towards it's actually more towards the middle of the fuel tank here on this second notched area. So this one is going to go in through this area up inside the frame, and you'll want to reach it all the way back so that it lines up with this hole here, and then you'll install another one of the 1/2-inch flange bolts with the large flat washer into that hole and thread it into the nut stick. All right, so we now got both of the nut sticks installed in the back side of the frame there. Hardware is just loosely installed. And up here, we need to show you guys real quick that you need to reinstall these e-brake cable brackets on the outside of this mounting plate here using the supplied longer bolts that we send with the kit, along with the flat washers there. For this video here, we had a little bit of a discrepancy on the vehicle year, and we didn't end up having the appropriate hole in the frame mounting plate to reattach this bracket here, but we will be adding that, so you'll need to reinstall the bolt here through that bracket into the frame as well to hold that one in place. So we have both e-brake brackets in place there with the longer bolts, and then don't forget the other one more towards the middle of the frame here, reinstall with the longer supplied bolt there as well. And then moving down towards the front of the rock slider, we have our other 3 1/2-inch flange bolts installed, and those are all loose right now. So once the rock slider is actually up tight against the frame, up tight against the side of the frame, you can go ahead and tighten all of that hardware that's installed right now. These 1/2-inch bolts can be tightened to 50 foot-pounds. These 8mm bolts in the bottom of the frame can go to 30 foot-pounds, and same with the bolts that go into the side of the frame up here. Those are also the 8mm bolts that can go to 30 pounds as well. So all of those can be tightened at this time. So all of the hardware that's been installed is now fully tightened down on the rock sliders. And the one remaining thing that needs to be done for the install, this is optional. This does not have to be done. It's kind of your choice if you'd like to add the additional hardware or not. But some holes will need to be drilled in the bottom of the frame. So right where these 2 square holes are, 3/8 hole can be drilled in the bottom of the frame so that these carriage bolts can be installed with flat washer and flange nut on the inside. And then up towards the front of the rock slider, where this flange comes down to the cross member, you can open up this hole that's already existing. There's 2 holes there. You can drill those out with a 5/16 drill bit, and then install these thread cutting screws. So these screws will go right into the hole. You put pressure on the screw as you're tightening it, and the screw will actually cut its own threads into the frame, and you can install those right into those 2 holes once you open them up to a 5/16. One tip here to make it a little easier to drill holes into the bottom of the frame rail. If your truck is tall enough, or if you have it up on jack stands, you should be able to fit a drill and a floor jack underneath the vehicle like that. So if you have someone to help you, you can run the drill as someone puts just a small amount of pressure on the floor jack at the same time, and that will make drilling holes in the bottom of the frame fairly easy. So these 2 thread cutting screws can be tightened to 20 foot-pounds, and these 2 3/8 carriage bolts that go into the square holes can be tightened to 30 foot-pounds. The first thing you want to do on this side here is there's a couple of plastic clips that will need to be removed from the frame in order to slide the rock slider up into place. So there's one about midway on the frame here. You want to squeeze that clip together and push it in through the frame. And then there's another one a little bit farther forward towards the front of the frame. Squeeze that one together and push it in through the frame. And again, to line up the rock slider, the easiest way is to line up this front mounting flange with the bottom cross member that goes across the frame here. That's just the easiest way to align the slider front to back and get ready to put the bolts in. So once it's held up in place, you can go ahead and put in a couple of these 1/2-inch flange bolts into any one of these holes here, and then in the rear mounting plate, this hole and this very back hole, So you can put a couple of those in first just to hold the rock slider loosely in place. So we have our passenger side rock slider loosely installed here. We lifted it up into place and installed the 1/2 inch flange bolts into the mounting plates. So those are not tight yet, but we just slid them up in place through the holes and then put the square plates on the back and the flange nut on the back of the bolt. So there's 3 in this front mounting plate all the way across, and then 2 on this rear mounting plate. And I'll show you again real quick the square mounting plates that go on the inside. So we've got our square steel plate on the inside of the frame. A couple of these on this side, there are some metal lines in the way, so you have to kind of pull the lines out away from the frame a little bit, or try to just slip the bolt plate in there first and then put the bolt through with the nut on the back. So just make sure that these steel plates are between the frame and this line, and they're not actually pinching that line and clamping down on it when you tighten the bolt. So up here towards the front of the frame, those ones are a little easier to access. You can slide the plate in behind those hard lines, again, just making sure that they're not pinched. So you can see here that we have a gap between the rock slider mounting plate and the frame. That's because our hardware is just loose right now. So we have our floor jack in place. We're gonna just push that underneath the vehicle and then lift up on the rock slider. We just put it underneath the frame mounting plate right there and lift it up into place so the slider is tight against the frame. And then we can go ahead and snug down a couple of these bolts a little bit tighter just to hold it against the frame and keep it up to the bottom of the frame, and then go ahead and install the rest of the hardware once that's in place. All right, so we've got our rock slider pushed up tight against the frame there. We tightened a couple of the 1/2 inch bolts and removed the floor jack out from under the rock slider now that it's in place on the frame where it needs to be. Then we installed 3/8 by 1 1/4 bolt here through the bottom of the frame. There is a hole already in the frame right there for this one. The front hole also gets a 3/8 bolt as well. Some Tundras have a hole there already, some do not, so you may have to drill that one if you'd like to install that one. And then the remaining hardware is just like the driver's side, so you'll need to drill a 3/8 hole here and here if you'd like to install those carriage bolts on the bottom. And then moving forward all the way to the front of the rock slider, you'll need to drill out these holes to a 5/16 and then install the thread cutting screw into those holes. So along with our 1/2 inch flange bolts that we have on the side of the frame, we also want to install, there's 3 3/8 by 1 1/4 bolts also go through the frame up towards these very 2 top holes on the rear mounting plate of the rock slider. And then as we move forward towards the front of the rock slider, there's another one farther up this way right here. So we get a 3/8 by 1 1/4 bolt through this hole as well on the front mounting plate. This hole had one of those plastic clips in it that we pushed through earlier in the video. That plastic clip holds brake lines on the inside of the frame. So we're going to show on the back side what that looks like to make sure you have your hardware in the correct place. So we're on the back side of the frame here at the front mounting plate of the rock slider. This is the 3/8 bolt that we put in, and this plastic clip used to be in that hole holding these brake lines in place. So you just want to pull these brake lines back and install the hardware, flat washer, lock washer, and then a nut onto that bolt. So you can leave these brake lines just sitting like this after you tighten the bolt down. As long as the brake line itself is not rubbing up against the bolt, they'll be fine, just located right there. So the other thing you want to do is go along the frame here. Once again, check that none of these brake lines, these steel brake lines, are pinched anywhere. by any of this hardware. Moving along towards the back of the frame here, there's another one of the 3/8 bolts we had to install. This one is a little difficult to get to. You kind of have to put from either side of this cross member, there's these big holes. You have to reach in through there to put your washers and nut onto that bolt. And then at the very back of the frame here, here's the final 3/8 bolt that goes through the rear mounting plate. And then there's also a 1/2-inch bolt back here. Just make sure that that square nut plate is not pinching any of those brake lines. So we now have our passenger rock slider fully installed, tightened all of the hardware, and I'm going to go around to the driver's side here and show that one is also complete. We have both sliders fully installed now. You just want to double check all of your hardware, make sure that it's tight. Once that is complete and all of your hardware is tightened down, your rock slider install is finished.